I think one of the things that people often forget is that Intune has been around for some time in different stages of evolution, of course. But Intune is not like an agent-based software. Intune's a framework that exists on Windows devices, and they can manage other frameworks as well. So, for example, Apple has their MDM framework on their macOS and iOS devices, and Intune has become a way of managing those frameworks specifically as well.
Welcome to Evolved Radio, where we explore the evolution of business and technology. I'm your host, Todd Kane. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Luis Giraldo. Luis is well known in the MSP channel for his role at IT Glue, but Luis has recently moved to Solarwinds. Also, lesser known fact that Luis is also an MSP owner. I'm not sure where he finds so many hours in the day, but I'm glad to have him as a return guest on the podcast. Luis was one of the very early guests of the podcast way back on episode 5, which I'll link to in the show notes. The topic for today is MSP tools again. Luis and I are chatting about the evolution of the RMM tool for MSPs and how the pandemic is influencing network management. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast so you get every new episode. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please leave a rating and review in your podcast app. This helps others find the show so we can reach more of the community. Now on with the show. And welcome to the podcast, Luis.
Thanks, Todd. Always a pleasure to hang out and get a chance to chat about everything and nothing at the same time.
That's what podcasts are for. That's right.
Yeah, there was this meme floating around sort of at the beginning of COVID. Is like, whatever you do, don't start another podcast.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the OG podcasts in the MSP space, I think. You're a returning champion as well. Had you on the podcast way back in episode 5. So we're into the late 50s, early 60 episodes now. But appreciate you coming back and catching up with us in the more modern IT and MSP world that we're potentially in a couple of years later.
Always a pleasure.
So today we're going to talk about tools in general, a little specifically on the RMM. For those that maybe don't know, you have a new role. Most people are probably familiar with you in your role at IT Glue, but you're now at Solarwinds. Do you want to give us maybe a quick skinny on the new role and where you're hanging out now?
Yeah. So, a bit of that context was, I built a documentation app back in 2013, which was acquired by IT Glue. In 2017, I spent 3 years there, roughly just under 3 years, in the VP of product role as that organization sort of got built out and the product team sort of had to build out from there because I arrived at a time when there's a couple of product functions, but not really a product team, so to speak. So it was an interesting opportunity there to build out a team, and it was a time when IT Glue was growing very quickly. After 3 years, earlier this year in January, sort of my employment there ended in a couple of months. I started chatting with SolarWinds, and there was sort of an interesting opportunity to come in to drive the launch of a marketing platform that we've been trialing and piloting with some partners on the SolarWinds side. This is pretty neat because the platform does sort of the campaign in a box type of thing. And as you know, MSPs have been traditionally pretty terrible at the marketing thing altogether. And it's funny, I kind of joke around that most MSPs wear like a badge of honor that they've never had to do any marketing. And, referrals are our number one way of getting new business. But then in the same breath, they also be like, but how do you get more leads? And so I always find that it's funny that there's like this love-hate thing with marketing and there's never any time to do it. So it's sort of a way to build a platform that was going to make it a little bit easier to get sort of low-touch marketing efforts out the door and relevant to the business outcomes and things that we're trying to articulate to customers. Being an MSP myself for the last 14 years helped me give a little perspective to that. And I've since actually moved away from that market tool role into something that was a little bit more specific to the RMM tools that SolarWinds has. And so I'm leading a little bit of the messaging strategy for N-Central and for SolarWinds RMM. A lot of people actually don't know SolarWinds has 2 different RMM products. And so N-Central, which is the more scalable solution that has been around a little bit longer, previously from the company Enable. A lot of people still know it as that. And then SolarWinds RMM, which is a product that came through the LogicNow acquisition some years ago. And so, yeah, working now very closely with those teams on the messaging and the marketing side. My role officially is one of marketing, and so it's kind of funny that I think the intent was bring in a MSP guy and give him a marketing role so that we can do MSP things, and not the other way around. Not bring in a marketing guy; you have to teach MSP things too, and so that's where we are.
Yeah, and it's certainly of value. I see the same thing. People at least are admittedly know that they're not great at marketing in the technical space. So any tools or augmentation that they can get from the vendors is always welcome. So I'm sure that that's a useful avenue for you guys to carry forward to the channel. So that's great. On the RMM side, I find the Solarwinds approach and sort of the more modern approach that I see the group taking is really interesting. Is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about that. We're seeing sort of a rise of some of the more multi-tenant tool sets from Microsoft, and a lot more around sort of the ecosystem management and systems management being a little more prevalent. And people keep kind of asking the questions, is Microsoft sort of building an RMM or something to compete with the RMM? And so far, SolarWinds is one of the companies that I find has really adopted that change in the market, and with N-Central in particular utilizing Intune as a vehicle for accessing the tools rather than viewing it as something that's potentially competitive. Do you want to maybe expand a bit on the strategy of leveraging Intune and SolarWinds' approach on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think a little context might make sense simply to understand sort of where the genesis of this is. And I think one of the things that people often forget is that Intune has been around for some time in different stages of evolution, of course. But Intune is not like an agent-based software. Intune's a framework that exists on Windows devices, and they can manage other frameworks as well. So, for example, Apple has their MDM framework on their macOS and iOS devices, and Intune has become a way of managing those frameworks specifically as well. However, there's also the sort of very important piece, which is the agent-based actions that a lot of the RMM tools can take. And even in the Mac space, you can manage a device with MDM, but you can also deploy an agent and do other things with the agent that the MDM tool is limited to, because again, the framework is kind of decided by the vendor. And so Microsoft decides what things you can manage through MDM on the Windows side. And then, there might be other tools that can manage those things, but Microsoft obviously has built out Intune to be the tool of choice for managing MDM on the Windows side. And so one of the challenges that has arisen over the last little while is, we still need our agent-based tools because there's so many things we can do with them, from inventory and reporting and management and obviously policies and things like that it's unrealistic to let go of the RMM agent altogether in favor of just Intune by itself. However, people are seeing the need to start using Intune for managing things like compliance and or conditional access, or stuff that is kind of really the meat and potatoes of the solution that Microsoft has built. And so the challenge obviously becomes, I need to manage all of this ideally in one place, report on all the devices in one place, and be able to manage everything centrally as much as possible. And so this multi-tenant capability was a concern, because on the Microsoft side, you had to jump into each individual customer tenant and manage things separately, manage policies separately. And then back in Ignite, I think maybe a month ago or so, they announced Azure Lighthouse for Intune or for 365. And there had been some Lighthouse capabilities that were launched on the Azure side, to allow you to manage cloud environments. But the Intune piece was sort of left out of that at the time. But now they announced that. However, it still doesn't really centralize your reporting, doesn't centralize your management necessarily. And so this is a great thing that N-Central has announced, is integrating directly with Intune to the degree of being able to even create and manage Intune policies directly in N-Central, but obviously also being able to get the visibility of those devices, reporting on those devices, and extending, for example, the import of Intune devices directly into N-Central, being able to deploy the agent to them this way, and sort of simplifying a little bit of that process of centralizing.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting perspective. I think the way you describe it as Intune is a framework, like sort of an MDM approach, and that's a great way to think about it. I had not actually considered that as a way to view it. I viewed it as sort of a management, an endpoint management tool more than sort of a delivery framework or an MDM profile management. But I think that is a much more apt description of sort of what it does. So that's great. Also, just to comment on the sort of the distinction between where the channel partner fit and the software fit is versus the Microsoft world. People often ask, is Microsoft going to start competing, or are they going to build an RMM and things like that? And I have largely kind of dismissed that idea. I think, sure, it's possible. Like they're starting to develop things that are more multi-tenant based, which has not really been a thing for them in the past, which is great to see because it can create sort of more of these options. But Microsoft's model has always been that they build 80% of the solution and then they leave the last 20% for the partner ecosystem to build that last layer, that last mile of functionality. And I don't really see that strategy changing in the near term. So I think it is a much better way to think about it as it's not a competitive situation. It's more, how do you layer this on and how do you leverage it to create more value? So, this morning I was watching a video from Microsoft describing sort of some of the features and functionalities that they have rolling out in the endpoint management and things like autopilot and how they leverage Intune for the endpoint management. And the way I sort of view this is everything they talk about, every time they talk about the endpoint manager or anything that relates to what is formerly SCCM, is you just sort of apply RMM over top of that, because they're often talking about an enterprise ecosystem delivery where it's one model, it's one company that they're deploying to. And in an MSP situation, it's multiple companies. And that's where it gets really tricky to do things on those traditional tools. So just saying, we have all this great ecosystem for deployment, but you still need an RMM to be able to touch all of the mechanisms that you need on each of those endpoints and have some distinction between this company versus that company, right?
Yeah, I think, there's also you mentioned the ecosystem, and I think that's an important part of it as well. Sometimes RMM is not just RMM, but it's also the whole platform and ecosystem that MSPs have built a service delivery model around. And it kind of starts with the RMM in a way, because, whenever you take on a new customer as an MSP, one of the first things you do is you deploy your RMM agents. You need the visibility into the assets. You need that kind of information before you can do more things. But that's only the beginning. There's also your EDR tool or AV tool of choice, your backup platform, and all these things are delivered through the RMM as much as possible. So I think, Intune is one of the layers or pieces that maybe is going to play a role here for things like I mentioned earlier, conditional access or compliance for security, especially as people more and more bring some of their workloads and services to the cloud, and they need to be able to secure these things based on a certain security state of those devices. And Microsoft kind of makes it a little bit of a black box in that sense. You can only use Microsoft tools to do things like conditional access potentially in certain scenarios. And so there might be some more flexibility there, but I think it'll just become another tool as part of that ecosystem or platform that MSPs build for delivering service.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the applications that they showed this morning in this video directly related to that was security profile management, where you could actually limit copy and paste between two separate on an application basis, right? So if you copied something from one place, the Windows wouldn't let you paste it somewhere else because there's sort of inline DLP management that's being managed through the endpoint directly, which I thought was kind of cool. The other one that they showed was being able to establish sort of an invisible tunnel. So the
Right.
VPN access is essentially demand based. So as soon as you open up a browser and it goes to somewhere that's supposed to be internally, it just magically creates a VPN for you and establishes that connection because it's aware of those things. So all of that is managed remotely by those profiles. So I think we'll start to see a lot more of that, where there's a more tightly integrated management of the endpoint directly versus that traditionally coming from GPO management being pushed and somewhat managed by the RMM. So I think that'll be a great thing to see more tightly controlled management of the endpoint through that. So one of the other things that was maybe switched to is scripting has always been a major superpower of the RMM. And I think sort of more and more, especially over the last 3 years, I've been pushing people like, don't build scripts in the RMM language. You're really sort of hamstringing yourself for future proofing. And I suggest if you're doing any type of scripting, just build in PowerShell, and then the RMM can call that PowerShell script and do whatever it needs to do. But it kind of limits, I think, the feature and capability of the traditional RMM, where if all that RMM does is give you assets, give you remote control, and call PowerShell scripts, then there's some people that are starting to question, well, what is the RMM useful for if that's all it's doing? And we've started to see some of the rise of these more nimble and upstart RMM or RMM and PSA combos in the industry. What's your take on sort of the shift around those two things of things being lighter, more nimble, and potentially just leveraging PowerShell scripts to get done what you need to do?
Yeah, I think it's basically just one angle of the whole ecosystem. Again, we're talking a little bit about the platform that MSPs are building in order to deliver service. And I think part of it is the evolution you might be on as an MSP. You might be starting in a place where your needs or requirements are fairly straightforward and basic. I'm not calling anybody basic. I'm just saying the requirements are sometimes basic. And as your organization or MSP evolves, and or you work with more complex customers or more complex situations, you either need more choice, you need more tools, or you need deeper capabilities within the tool set, deeper reporting, deeper analytics. And this is where some of those sort of single tool, single solution type of environments maybe fall short down the line. On the scripting comment, I think you're right. PowerShell, Microsoft has demonstrated over and over again that they rely on PowerShell for a lot of the deeper management in a lot of their tool sets. The perfect example of this is how hamstrung the Graph API is compared to the things you can do via PowerShell. There's a lot of capabilities in PowerShell that you just don't have access to with normal Graph API endpoints. And so the challenge, obviously, is if you write things in PowerShell, you sort of are in the Microsoft ecosystem already. But even as an MSP, where we've gone and done some pretty deep Teams deployments, for example, or Teams voice deployments, there are certain things, even as the GUI for certain tools evolve, that are not even available in GUIs yet. So you can't do certain configurations or certain management, and you have to sort of rely on the PowerShell console for some of those tools to do things like mass automation of assignments of phone numbers, or and this is the perfect example. We did a deployment of Teams voice for a 130-person organization, and the challenge was, well, you don't want to click through each one of them to assign a phone number. Well, let's get this on a spreadsheet, figure out how to automate this through PowerShell and run the thing that way. And so 100%, I think PowerShell is the way to go. And the tools that offer maybe some black box scripting language to do things their own way should be maybe a word of caution. I think in this sense, Solarwinds has stayed on the right side of history by making sure you can leverage PowerShell as is to do all your scripting and automation in the tools and scripts and requirements that you have.
Yeah. Maybe a bit of history or a bit of perspective on some of the things that you're doing as an MSP might be interesting as well. Like, what are some of the interesting or novel ways that you guys have leveraged your RMM? I see a lot of people ask, what are the things that I could and should do with my RMM? And it's one of those questions that gets asked a lot, and no one really volunteers a lot of answers. It's like everyone's just sort of waiting for someone to gift them this magical repository of RMM scripts. Any suggestions of things that people should consider on if the RMM is good enough, they've got it well deployed, it's well tuned, but they're just not leveraging the power that they could potentially be pulling from it? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, I certainly, I've had some interesting conversations about this in the last couple months. One of them was actually a webinar we did with Kyle Hansloven from Huntress, where we were trying to talk a little bit about security and aligning with CIS controls, but a little bit of the messaging and or outcome of this session was, hey, you can actually be using your RMM tool today, right now, to do some of the alignment with CIS controls and improving security posture, just generally speaking. And so I think one of the challenges of RMM is that the reason people get into it initially is the remote control capability that most RMM tools provide, and oftentimes people don't get too deep past that requirement initially. So I can do my remote control, I can deploy an application, and great, I've got it covered, and then they're just busy fighting fires the rest of the time to get into deeper functionality of the RMM. But I'd say the security posture is a really big, important conversation. Most things that are the basis of security best practices, you can do with your RMM tool today. Securing endpoints in a certain way, or deploying policies, or making sure that things that you can run with PowerShell, for example, en masse, a whole fleet of devices or across all your customers, you can drive a certain expected state of the machine. And so that webinar is interesting. Maybe I'll provide some links to you that you can put in the show notes, because I think these things will be interesting for people to look up and research what kind of stuff they could be doing with RMM today. Another thing that I think SolarWinds has been really great at is there is fantastic resource called the Cookbook. And the Cookbook is a collection of scripts and automation policies and things like that that work with SolarWinds products. But obviously the basis of these is PowerShell. So behind the scenes, they're running PowerShell scripts, but every sort of situation that MSPs go through, the market trends, so to speak, will drive some of the needs of these efforts. And so, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were like, hey, how do I deploy like a VPN connection in a script to a device? Because now I have to do it on hundreds of devices potentially, or at least dozens of devices per client. And there's just no way I can do this manually, computer by computer. And so there's a ton of resources like that are sort of driven by trends, but that over time turn into a really fantastic collection of capabilities and tools and things you could be doing with automation instead of manually. I mean, it's funny because typically VPN access requests are very sporadic and one by one. And so you never think I should automate deploying a VPN profile to a Windows device or to a Mac computer. But when you have to do dozens at a time, the prospect of having to do them manually is just absolutely heartbreaking. And so this is where some of the needs will drive people's necessity to automate and figure out how to do these things at scale. So I think that's an important piece of RMM, is learning how to do things at scale.
Yeah, that's certainly many of the lesson. One of the many lessons that the pandemic has taught us is this forced acceleration and very different scenarios than what we've been used to or exposed to in the past, for sure.
COVID CIO, yeah.
COVID CIO, yeah. That's a good one as well. Like one of the things that I love, like we kind of mentioned about autopilot before and utilizing Intune, but the deployment of home machines or even corporate devices that don't go to your office in the MSP, get configured and then shipped to the other office for the client to be deployed. Like a lot of that just doesn't happen anymore. Slowly some organizations are returning to their office, but quite frankly, a lot of companies will continue to have a significant portion of their workforce still at home. So I see this as one of the sort of the beauties of how we do this in the future, leveraging the RMM and the tools from Microsoft to be able to deploy those new laptops in a controlled fashion outside of your corporate network in the end user's home. And I think that is something that people need to become very familiar with for single deployments, because it makes it easier, but also mass deployments, because you can't be carting stuff around and shipping it out to the office to do those physical installs in some cases anymore.
Yeah, well, I went against the pandemic recommendations of not starting a podcast and actually started one called Café con Luis. And so you and I talked about this, but the first episode or first installment of Café con Luis was with Matt Lee. Matt Lee is just one of those great guys that has a really wide breadth of thought and analysis, and really can see across the tool sets and the trends and everything else to really design awesome solutions. And Matt's at Iconic IT in the US, a fairly large MSP, I think about 170, 180 people or so. That was from a group of MSPs that came together. And so he's obviously designing strategy for a fairly large organization. But anyways, we did a session about zero touch deployment. And we sort of got into this whole thing about autopilot and Intune and the ability to even use that as your basis to enroll your devices into N-Central or obviously whatever RMM you happen to be using. But it's so powerful because at the same time that you can deploy at scale, one of the things that's interesting is how much PE or private equity is driving rapid growth in some industries, in some markets, and small business as MSPs, we typically deal with businesses that are not necessarily exposed to this. But I've met MSPs that are working in life sciences and or in finance. And when there's a big investment that comes into one of those companies, all of a sudden they're like hiring dozens of people per week or spinning up a new city or a new location. And, if the MSP wants to compete and stay in that game, they have to be able to deploy very quickly. And so this autopilot to Intune enrollment functionality is so great because you can have your vendors like Dell, Lenovo, HP, whomever, enroll your devices for you at sale, or even your distributors like Ingram, Tech Data, Synnex, D&H, so on. And then those devices magically show up in your Intune console, and Intune can have a policy that deploys your End Central agent. And all of a sudden, without ever touching that device, you have a situation where the machine is fully enrolled, policies were deployed, and even at the login screen at first boot, the device can show a branded experience to the end user with the login screen that matches. They recognize everything. They can sign in with their Azure or Microsoft 365 credentials, and you're off to the races. And so imagine having to ship, a dozen devices or several dozen devices to the shop to configure and then having to ship them back out. Just logistically, it's a nightmare. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a matter of scale. Some of these businesses are moving way faster than we've ever, been accustomed to before. And these kind of tools are an important part of the tool set of the stack. It was interesting in the session we did, we kind of surveyed the attendees, and we had over 1,000 people register for that particular session. And a very low percentage of people were actually leveraging Autopilot and or Intune today. And obviously there's licensing costs and things like that to consider, where typically these things have been below the line on the MSP side. RMM agents are the things that are squarely inside of the platform of the MSP. And so I can see how this is a transition that is going to happen over time. But I think what's interesting is Autopilot's been around since 2017. And yet, there's a very low percentage of people actually leveraging the tool at scale. So clearly a big opportunity for MSPs to get smarter about deploying and just making that process easier to get connected remotely.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen the same thing every time I bring up Autopilot around, have you guys tested this? Have you experimented with it when people are talking about struggling with deployments, either singularly or fleet deployments? And they're like, no, I don't know. I think I've heard about it, but no, I haven't looked at it. So yeah, I agree that the adoption of it is woeful at this point, unfortunately. I think people hopefully will start to jump on that over the next year or so, but that'd be a great shift as well. The other part that you mentioned that I don't think there's a ton of awareness around, and it stands on kind of reiterating, is that pre-deployment and leveraging your disti to accelerate that deployment by having them either deploying an image or doing the Autopilot or Intune enrollment, right? That is huge. And that's another one that I find, people are often just simply unaware that that's even a possibility. So if that's not something you're doing and you'd like to accelerate your deployment capability, by all means, talk to your disti and ask them about pre-enrollment, or even golden image deployment gets you further ahead so that when you can attach something, it just picks up the enrollment in the RMM and starts to take off to do the rest of the deployment in an automated fashion. So that's a huge plus as well. It's worth noting.
Yeah, and I think the challenge, like we mentioned earlier, is that some of these things happen so piecemeal that you never think, oh, I'm going to stop and build a process for this, so that, over time you sort of accumulate the time savings. And so I think it sort of becomes part of the best practice of each MSP is like, okay, we're actually going to build this process this way for every new client we bring on. We're going to go talk to disti and set up their deployment process to make sure those things are done that way. And it just takes a little bit of an attitude shift to make sure you're building in that kind of scalable way. Because, not everybody has honestly the time to think about these things. And we do it a bit on the Mac side, depending on the client. A larger client that is, we take on that might bring a bunch of older machines. And part of the strategy is to help them life cycle these machines out and get into newer hardware. We realized right up front, it's like, okay, we should have the whole Apple Business Manager and the deployment enrollment program set up so that we can deploy very easily and not sort of be hampered by having to do one-on-one deployments and bring the machines in. And same thing with the Windows aspect. Recently, we worked with a client that was like, we were potentially looking at expanding to multiple locations across the US even. So we're not going to be able to do anything there. We're going to have to be able to ship devices directly from a distie in the US to that customer site. And we're never going to be able to touch machines ahead of time. So 100%, we have to think about autopilot and Intune and all these other capabilities. So yeah, super important.
Yeah. I guess one other piece on the work from home and the BYOD aspect of the sort of the pandemic acceleration. What's your view on sort of the forced management of these sort of aggregate networks where like most of the devices are not sort of inside the corporate network and everyone's working from home? Some of them have corporate defined assets. Others just are using their home PC with some levels of either VPN connection or some RDS implementation. What's your view on sort of that shift of the network being broken up from that centralized model to now a very decentralized model where everything is cloud-based, a little bit is functions in the office, and everything else is kind of on the periphery of the network?
Yeah, I think this is where obviously a strong layered security strategy is going to have a big role in how you think about this, because, if all your security relied on devices being behind a firewall and that's it, then this is going to put a real damper on your ability to bring devices outside the network. But even as applications or workloads are being moved into Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or whatever, I think you see the need to secure the application, to secure the transit, to secure the conditional access. And so I think all these additional layers will get added to the whole operation. And the better you can do that at scale, obviously, the easier it is to protect all those end users, no matter what device they're using. Conditional access is interesting because you can define that a device can't access an application if at least Windows Defender is not installed on the device. And so will that user using their home device trying to access a web interface, that web application can check if Defender is installed and if it's updated. And if it's not, sorry, you can't access this. So at least you remove the need to put a very onerous agent or management or some other thing on the user's personal device, which they may not want, and you sort of protect the destination service or application instead. So I think those things are important to start thinking about now, because I don't see any business, bringing more things on-prem. On the contrary, I see more people moving more things into the cloud and or leveraging the existing file sharing that is available with 365 or that kind of tool.
So this is a question that I had someone ask me. I was going to look for someone to bring on specifically for this podcast, but I'll cut to you on this question because you kind of raised it. Is someone was asking, what is the use of the firewall now? Because if all I have is just a single PC that doesn't hold a lot of secure information, it's more about just securing its access to other things that are controlled in other places. So they're kind of questioning the old model of you need a firewall here, you need a firewall there, you need to deploy a firewall for them at home with some specific capability versus just a home router with a firewall built in is maybe good enough. What's your feeling on that? Is the sort of the use and the function of the firewall being somewhat degraded based on this shift in the network, or is there still a necessary need in sort of this distributed environment for strong firewalls?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the client, obviously, and there's going to be workloads or applications or things that you're still running on premises because there's just no other way to do it, and or it's potentially too costly to move an entire server environment to the cloud, or it's a heavy cluster of Citrix or a remote desktop for some very graphic intensive thing that it's just more economical to run on premises. And in those situations, you want to make sure that people get behind the network securely, and you want a firewall because the firewall can inspect traffic, can do IDS, IPS, that kind of stuff to make sure that malicious traffic is not making its way into the network. But also, I feel like there's a corporate responsibility to ensure that bad traffic also doesn't get out of your network if something happens, because this is the other piece of if a machine is compromised and somebody uses it for spamming or as a spam bot to send messages out to the internet, your firewall typically grabs that stuff and can lock down that device. But if you're not, and you're sort of the source of infection and or malware and or spam email, it's kind of like we need to build that curtain for everybody. But We have clients that are not going to anytime soon move their workloads to the cloud just yet, for cost reasons. And in their case, it just makes sense to have a good firewall on premises that is protecting the traffic, something that has the capacity. Also, the other thing is connection speeds here in Vancouver, at least. You can get a gigabit connection for $100 a month. And so your typical, entry level small business firewalls are not going to cut it for doing this kind of traffic, that speed, and sort of driving a bit of those connectivity requirements. And so you invest in a firewall, you get the nice speeds, and you get the protection of the traffic as well. And if you're hosting resources internally, a website, some kind of application that people need to access, a timesheet thing, an ERP software, there's so many permutations of it. Then you want to make sure that you can lock down the traffic, where it's coming from. Perfect example, one of our architectural clients, they host a file transfer sharing application internally for working with contractors and designers and so on. And before there was a firewall that allowed the granular control over who could access it, we'd see a lot of connectivity attempts from places like China and Russia and South Korea and places like that. And eventually they'd consume all the web sessions from trying to connect to break into the service, and the service would go down. And so with a good firewall, we were actually able to do country-based filtering and be able to say, okay, well, realistically, we only need people connecting from the US and Canada and maybe a couple other countries, and all those kinds of problems start to go away. But the visibility of a good firewall into the network and what's happening is a kind of a key piece of understanding how to protect the network as well.
Okay, appreciate that. Anything else that you would comment on in the post-COVID world, how that is either accelerated things or changed the sort of the form or function for delivery of IT?
Yeah, I think obviously there's probably more complexity being discovered as we go into a post-COVID world, simply because people are, there's a combination of like shadow IT going on. The traditional things that IT was managing as it was prior to the pandemic were not enough, and just people went, signed up for service and started doing things, around the corner. Outside of the purview of IT. And so obviously IT is scrambling to try and bring that back under control. And there's the balance of convenience and security, right? And so I think a lot of MSPs need to focus on how can we deliver an efficient service to end users that is not going to hamper their ability to stay productive. And I think building on that capability and making sure that they're having conversations and not assuming that people are running everything through the channels of IT is probably the biggest thing. But yeah, complexity is probably increasing. And I'm keen to see sort of the opportunity to help some of our own customers on the MSP side make their transition to cloud and help with their digital transformation and be more of a partner in that journey, of course.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That's what I see as sort of the future of the market right now is more of that consultative, more business and technology road mapping is really central right now because things are changing quickly and things will continue to change over the next 1 to 3 years. And a good technology consultant and a good technology provider is assisting the client with that roadmap and that development and being progressive in how they're addressing the business needs and with technology solutions rather than just sort of going by the whims of the business or being dragged around by their requirements as well. So I think that's a big shift from just providing sort of the typical stack towards, how do you actually transition towards what this thing looks like 5 years from now?
I also I think the role of IT will shift a little bit to one of like guidance and empowerment and facilitation. I think right now we're probably still under the spell of IT control a little bit. And I think this is maybe going to be counterproductive to how some businesses need to be unleashed, if you will, to be able to work freely, however, the situation dictates. And so the sooner I think we realize that it's our job to empower and guide and all those things, the probably better off we'll be. We'll be seen more of a partner in that situation than the person that's trying to hold everybody back by applying unnecessary control to every situation. So I think us IT people, we love control, however. And so I think it'll be an interesting dynamic for us to figure out how to manage in our own heads or in our own businesses. But I think it'll be an important part of it too.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Anything else, Luis, before we wrap up? Anything you want to, either a call to action or other topics I haven't addressed yet?
A big metaphysical statement to end our podcast interview with. No, I appreciate, getting the chance to chat about, like I said before, everything and nothing. Some of these things in isolation are maybe insignificant, but the only thing I'm trying to do is trying to think a little bit more at scale, because even though the MSP at least is a small MSP, I think will sort of hinder our own abilities for growth, our own abilities to help customers transition if we're not able to think like a big customer needs to think. And this is what I've kind of picked up from Microsoft, is that a lot of how they build tools is with like the massive enterprise in mind, and everything that they build has massive scalability capabilities. And so I think that's interesting. That's fascinating to me technically. And so I'm always curious about how do we build for scale. But also it's kind of the thought process I bring into Solarwinds a bit. And we're trying to make sure that we're thinking about products and building products in a way that allows everybody from a small entry level MSP that needs to do some basic things like remote control and some basic policies and security, all the way to the MSP that needs to automate a lot of functions and things at scale. So that's what's pretty exciting. And to get to straddle both sides of that fence is, I think, a unique opportunity for a guy like me. And so I'm pretty happy about the chance to do that.
Cool. Well, we appreciate your contributions to the channel, Luis, and thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, man.